Our next keynote speaker is Anna Pierce, the Director of Sustainability at Tate Lyle. Our keynote address is about lessons in scaling a regenerative agriculture program. Now, this should be absolutely fascinating. Anna, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Lovely. So I'll pass the virtual floor to you.
Okay. So it's great to be here. I'm here today to talk a little bit about scaling regenerative agriculture and what that actually means, what it's meant for Tate Lyle, as well as some of our lessons learned along the way that maybe will be beneficial to others that are in this journey along with us. A little bit about Tate Lyle. Who are we? What are we doing? We are a global leader in sweetening, mouthfeel, fortification to make healthier food and beverages for consumers. We're a 160-year-old company with a global footprint that really does help partner with customers and those providers of food products and beverages for consumers, thinking about what the future looks like. We're a purpose-driven organization, so we believe that we can grow our business, but do so in a responsible way that has a positive impact on society. That is the foundation of everything that we do, all of our innovation and our product offerings for our customers and ultimately to consumers. As a purpose-driven organization, we have 3 pillars or foundations of that purpose: supporting healthy living and the ingredients that we provide, building thriving communities, particularly in our supply chains and in cities and towns where we operate. And then what we're here to talk about today, which is caring for our planet, which really envelops our entire sustainability program, as well as some of our ESG programs. So when we dig a little bit deeper into caring for our planet at Tate Lyle is grounded in commitments and targets that we've set over recent years. We're committed to achieving net zero by 2050. Along the way with that are pretty ambitious emissions reduction targets for 2030. They are approved science-based targets by SBTi. Along with that comes a commitment to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. So you're starting to see some of those programs laying into how we're going to get to net zero by 2050. And I think as we thought about making those commitments and others think about making those commitments, it's important to have a sense of the impact that decarbonization of industry will have on you and your companies, and then really developing out what's that roadmap. And we're never going to get to that 100% place when we're in the 2020s now, but certainly as we get closer to 2050, that unknown gap we expect to decrease as technology improves and we have more solutions that we can tap into. One of those solutions is what we're here to talk about today, and that's supporting sustainable agriculture for our key ingredients and raw materials. Along with that, we have commitments on making sure that we have responsible production as a food and beverage ingredient supplier so that we have public targets on waste and water reductions in our manufacturing sites. So how are we doing against those commitments? So it's not about just setting them, but also doing something with the targets that we've set. Our company went through a significant restructuring last year. So the results that you see are for the continuing operations as the footprint of Tate Lyle today. We've seen a nice reduction in scope 1 and 2 emissions, mostly through capital expenditure and projects and plans that we've been working to implement. We have conducted decarbonization assessments at all of our sites to really, again, lay in what that roadmap looks like. See nice reductions in scope 3 and good improvements in beneficial use of waste and water reduction. We do have a commitment in our company to support sustainable agriculture that's equivalent to our global corn procurement volume. So for us, that's a little over 237,000 acres that are enrolled in a sustainable agriculture program. So when we talk about scale, that is the scale of the sustainable agriculture program for corn that I'll be talking about today. So what is sustainable agriculture at Tate Lyle? And why don't we just jump straight into talking about regenerative agriculture? For us, there's two key components of a sustainable agriculture program. And it's first that we're protecting the planet through those regenerative agriculture practices. So practices that really focus on restoring soil health, have positive impacts on the environments, support increased biodiversity, and conservation practices where they're appropriate on fields and farms. And every field and farm has a different plan that's right for them. And then the second part of that is really focused on the social and economic well-being of the farmers that make up our supply chain. So it's one thing to have a regenerative agriculture program, but at the heart of it for us goes back to our pillar of building thriving communities. That starts with our suppliers. So if the practices that we're asking them to adopt or consider adopting or piloting aren't in their economic well-being, then those aren't practices that we as a company should be asking them to do. And I think that sometimes it's easy to get caught up in what's the greenhouse gas reduction? How do I report out on this? And maybe not necessarily think that some of these farmers are literally betting their family farm on the solutions that we're asking them to trial. So it's important to make sure that those two things go hand in hand. So that's the foundation of our sustainable agriculture program. When we talk about the program and the progress that we make year over year, it's important once we have the baseline to be really transparent in the progress that we've made in these programs or in the pilots that we're running. It's one thing to talk about them, it's one thing to try new things, but it's very important to also be able to measure the impact that you're having. It helps convince other farmers to maybe try something that they're a little bit reluctant to do. And it also demonstrates to our shareholders that we're using our investments wisely and we're making a real contribution to climate resiliency within our supply chain. So for us, we look at soil health, we look at greenhouse gas emissions, again, focused on those scope 3 targets. We look at the impact on watershed quality. So some of those metrics of erosion, eutrophication, we can look back and say, we're helping to improve the local watershed. And then lastly, again, is that grower livelihood component. So why are we doing this, right? So some of us, our investors are asking us to set science-based targets. In some cases, our customers are asking us to set science-based target. Or our consumers want to have products that are more responsibly sourced and manufactured. All of those reasons. But at the heart of it, we're estimated to see a population growth that we haven't experienced in the past. So in the next 40 years, we have to be able to responsibly produce what we produced in the last 8,000 years. That's a tremendous increase. And all of that food comes from agriculture. So we need to be able to feed that growing population using regenerative agriculture practices that not only have the opportunity to reduce the carbon and combat climate change, but also are kind of the last great hope in combating climate change through ultimately capturing and sequestering that carbon. So we have some pretty big problems to solve in the food and beverage industry, and this is the space that we're focusing on. So when you look at our programs, we have 2 sustainable agriculture programs running. One is corn that I talked a little bit about in the introduction, and the other one is stevia. They're vastly different programs. So corn program, you have large commercial scale farming operations based in the Midwest US. Corn's been farmed for thousands of years. There's precision agriculture. They know exactly what they need to do. Grower education is in a new topic or trialing a new product, a new input, a new method. And then you have stevia, which for us is small shareholder farmers based in Eastern China. They're literally betting their family farm and their livelihoods on the changes that we're asking them to adopt. Stevia has been farmed for about 40 years. So there's a lot of opportunity in stevia farming to make advances that don't exist when you look at row crop production in the States. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both because I think there's lessons learned to be had in both of them. For us, our sustainable corn program started in 2018 through a partnership with Truterra. It is a vertical within Land O'Lakes. Land O'Lakes is one of the largest grower-owned cooperatives in the States. In part, we've piloted and worked with them and built our program with them because it's farmer-owned. There's an intrinsic level of trust that a farmer-owned cooperative is not going to tell farmers to do something that's not in their best interest, and that aligns fully with our purpose. The program continues to be one of the largest sustainable agriculture programs registered with Field to Market, and we partner with our customers to accelerate that adoption of conservation and regenerative agriculture practices, and also enable them to get data to report out on their own responsible sourcing targets and Scope 3 emissions reductions. So how are we doing with that? That's a lot of corn. We had a little over 1 million acres enrolled in the program since 2019. 2019 was the year that we stepped out of that pilot phase and enrolled the full equivalency of what we were procuring globally. Again, that's prior to the restructure, so the numbers are a little bit lower today. I think in that scaling up, we were unique in that we went all in. And we went all in because looking back, you're never going to regret having better data or having more data. So as we look at the new flag targets by SBTi, as we look at changes in the greenhouse gas protocol and land use, we're able to go back into that data set and say, how is this going to affect us? How is this going to affect the farmers enrolled in the program? What's our plan? How are we going to report out on these changes and kind of start to realize them in the targets that we set? I think if you go back and you don't have some of those data sets, some of those discussions and planning and strategy setting becomes a little bit more challenging. So where do you start? You start where you are, you start where your farmers are, gathering as much information that you can, being mindful of the farmer's productivity, but knowing that ultimately you'll want to tap back into those resources as you set your own targets or as you look at some of the metrics that you'd like to measure to really demonstrate that you're having an impact. In the program, we've had a good grower retention rate, right? They intrinsically see value in the program, which is nice to see. They're not financially incentivized to participate. We're not funding this for them. This is something that they voluntarily are participating in. What it does is it lets them run scenarios based on changes in agricultural practices and the adoption of regenerative practices and what the impact is on the environment and what the impact is on their farm from a return on investment standpoint. So again, that goes hand in hand with that purpose that we have that's the cornerstone of all of our programs. We continue to see progress here. We're excited about the USDA grant on the Climate Smart Commodities Initiative. We continue to partner with our customers to accelerate projects to see those reductions and help with the practice change. But this for us is that example of a very large scale program in the States when we talk about regenerative agriculture and row crop production. Now, if we switch to China, it's a little bit of a different story. So we partnered with Earthwatch Europe and Nanjing Agricultural University back in 2019 to conduct a life cycle analysis. It's a less mature crop, so it was important to us to understand what was the impact we were having. Was it positive? Was it not so positive? And really inform the regenerative agriculture program that we were working to build. So the results of that LCA in 2019 informed our pilot that started in Dongtai in 2021. We continue to expand the farmers with the program. I'll tell you exactly opposite of what we did in the States, which was go big and go fast, was go slow in part because of COVID. Admittedly, I would have wanted to push this program faster than what we pushed it. And in not being as accelerated as what we wanted to and taking some of the bumps that came along with COVID, it really did help us establish a better relationship with the farmers that are participating in China. They are participating in education sessions. There's a huge focus on learning more about the space, learning more about the impacts, and the willingness to change particularly as long as it has a positive impact on their yield or on their return on investment, right? So again, it has to go hand in hand. For us, it let the farmers see what was going on our pilot farms and let the whole community of farmers follow along with us on that journey and say, okay, I think next year I'm going to try it. I wasn't going to do it this year, but next year I am. And we saw that again with the program that we're rolling out for 2023. So sometimes speed isn't always great. I do think it's important to be able to read the farm and know where the farmers are at and their willingness to jump in, or perhaps maybe some of the drivers behind being a little bit more cautious there. Our program again focused on the areas where we saw the most opportunity for impact from that life cycle analysis. And for us, that was really helping the farmers to understand their own soil health, conducting soil samples, analyzing the results. Once they analyze the results, transcribing that into what they're actually going to do differently on their farm in the next growing season. And the other big component of that was fertilizer optimization. So I'll share a little bit more about what we did there. So how did the pilot go? Pilot went well. We saw an improvement in every single indicator that we measured in the LCA. Some of the more significant improvements, if you can see here, I think from a farmer's perspective, there was this thought of more is better. So I should water more. I should put more fertilizer on it. The stevia will grow bigger. I'll get a better yield. I'll have higher glycoside content. And that wasn't always the case. So as they were going through this process, there was a learning curve on their perspective of, I'm doing less and things are working out better for me on the farm, right? And there's a lot of farmers that were really skeptical about that. So again, that slower pace, that pilot farm helped them want to pilot that process themselves. So seeing is believing. Our fertilizer reduction through this project averaged between 60 and 80%, which is a lot of fertilizer. If you look at field A and you look at field B, you can see a stark contrast between both of the stevia plants in the fields. Just the size of them, the number of stevia plants, the kind of blank spaces that you see. So which one do you think is cultivated with less fertilizer? We asked this question to some of our leaders and got some fun responses. It was field B. And again, for those farmers that participated, seeing was believing. We saw reductions in all of the metrics that we measured, particularly for Scope 3, greenhouse gas emissions. We saw better soil health. We saw improved water quality, local water quality, which has issues with being poor because of the amount of fertilizer that's used. So there was a direct benefit fairly quickly. But obviously we saw a yield increase, and then the quality of the stevia leaf itself improved throughout this process. So more wasn't better, but they literally had to see field by field for some farmers to say, okay, next year I'm going to do that. The other farms that did this, they had a better yield. They had a better profit than I did. What can I do to make more money? And frankly, buy less fertilizer for my farm, spend less time in the field applying that fertilizer. It seems like a win-win because that's the way it's designed. So in that program, we really did let the farmers lead us. And I think that there is a big component of these programs, and the speed at which you scale is meeting the farmers where they are. If you have a crop that's a row crop that's been farmed for thousands of years, odds are those farmers have precision ag, know exactly what they need to do, may be hesitant to try that conservation practice or switch to no-till. Maybe they don't want to plant cover crops. It might be a scale of economy issue. It might be a labor shortage. But I think it's important to understand what the drivers are behind where they're at, so you can really understand what motivates them. And then you can start to think through how to execute on that strategy and what the pace of your program looks like and why, so that everyone that's participating feels like they're an active participant in the program, versus us coming out and saying, here's our sustainable agriculture program. We want you to do what we say because we think we know better than you do. That's not something that any participating farmer in our program will ever get from a Tate Lyle sustainable agriculture program. It's not the way that we approach those kinds of relationships. I think it is important to have data and to have a science-led approach. Why are you doing what you're doing? Are you starting with what's most impactful, or are you starting with what's maybe the least expensive to invest in, or the easiest change for the farmers to check the greenhouse gas box? All of those things are important, but it's really understanding where your biggest opportunity for impact is. I've talked a lot about the pilots and the scale and the pace and really demonstrating the impact. But I think the last part is just being transparent. With COVID, we had really big ambitions in China, and there were lockdowns, or we couldn't get the sample back to the lab to analyze it in time. So we lost that sample. And I think it's important to help the farmers understand when things are going according to plan, and when you have to kind of pause and say, we wanted that to be double next year, but we're not there because we had these other things happen, and maybe we need to repilot that agricultural practice to make sure it really is going to be beneficial for you. It looks beneficial, but we really need to see what the data tells us. And I think that's where you really build farmer trust in the programs. For us, we share the results and the education sessions with the farmers that participate, as well as the farmers in the community that aren't. And I also think there's a level of trust that you're building there just to bring the entire farming community along on the journey with you, whether or not they're involved in the program, whether or not they're supplying you. There's a direct impact to that entire community, which makes the project, I think, at the end of the day, more authentic, and really focuses on bringing everyone up to providing a better ingredient and doing it in a more responsible way. So the last thing for us is a Lancet quote: "The single strongest lever to optimize human health and environmental sustainability on Earth is from food." So we have a tremendous opportunity. Food and beverages have a tremendous impact and footprint right now. So it is not a one company versus another company who got there first. It's very much a partnership that all of us take a step forward collectively, because it really is one of our greatest opportunities. And with that, I'll thank you for your time and open it up for any questions, any comments.
Anna, thank you very, very much. We have plenty of questions, so I will crack into them pretty quickly. One thing you were just touching on at the end leads in beautifully to one of the questions we've had in from our virtual audience, who are never short of questions for us, and that is about the balance between helping farmers who can be involved or are involved, and maybe those who can't. And the question is, how do sustainable agriculture practices affect farmers in the more developing parts of the world who might not have the money to make those kind of innovations?
I think that's part of the program design. Initially for us, our first part of the pilot in China, our greatest opportunity was to manage their fertilizer use, and really educate them just on soil samples and soil health, which is foundational to really farming in and of itself. So I think thankfully for us, that first phase of the program, there was an immediate benefit of buying less inputs than what they had done the previous year. So participation didn't cost anything to the farmers up front. I think when you start to have programs that cost real money to those farms up front, that's where we start to think about how we help to defray that cost, what partnerships we can make either with NGOs or with our customers to help defray that cost so that the farmers aren't taking on all of that risk. It's a different approach depending on really what you're asking them to do in terms of piloting practice changes.
We've got plenty of other questions, so thank you for keeping that answer relatively short. It's almost like you read my mind there. Next one from Oscar. What evolving technologies you see being applied to transform agriculture and how this is used? So I'll extend that question a little bit, if I may, Oscar. In terms of evolving technologies, what is there out there in this field that excites you at the moment?
I think we've seen some work on soil sampling and remote monitoring that seems really promising. Admittedly, we've participated in a pilot or two that didn't go as well with a few startups as what we had hoped. So I think there's opportunities to get better primary data from agricultural practice change that perhaps is less labor intensive to get. So I'm excited about how we get the data and trying to streamline that process for the farmers and still make sure that it's accurate at the same time, but that they don't have to have their hands on every single data point, every single keystroke. I think in part it's really trial and error. So I think that's a big part of it. I also am excited, not so much from a technology standpoint, but that the days of us looking at our own fence line and saying, I'm concerned about what happens in my square corner of the world are over, because there's so much focus on climate change that the partnerships and innovation that comes from collective group thought around how do we tackle this problem or how do we help defray the costs. I think that's where we see some of the changes, and that in and of itself is promising because we weren't there 4 or 5 years ago.
And one final question, if I may, before we go to the networking break. And as I always say, you never want to hold up the networking break too much because people do get grumpy. It does happen. It does happen.
It does.
Obviously, many people are nervous about anything to do with GMO crops, anything which involves any kind of intervention. How important is it for you that consumers are convinced and reassured that any kind of intervention when it comes to battling food scarcity is just and right and not just playing God? How important is that messaging for you?
I think it all comes down to the consumers, right? So when you listen to these consumer panels, you have consumers that say, I don't want any GMOs. I know exactly what they are, and their definition is correct, and that they buy based on that. And then you have other consumers that say, well, maybe climate change resiliency isn't so bad. Maybe that means that GMOs are a good thing or aren't a bad thing, and I don't care when I go to the grocery store. For us, I think really it involves that full-scale offering, right? So we have products that are GM-based, that are produced by U.S. corn, that's GMO corn that goes into our products. Then we have other products produced in the States or produced in Europe that aren't. So I really think it's about making sure that you're offering options for consumers and our customers in their products so consumers have a choice.
And transparency.
I don't want to be in a position where I personally would be telling a consumer choose one versus the other. I think it really does come down to that personal choice and ultimately consumer education as well.